Beneath the moon, where dark waters creep, a ship sails still where the lost ones sleep. A silent cry, a restless sound, echoes of deep where shadows are found. The wind whispers tales from the ocean's heart, of souls adrift, torn apart. A legacy of sorrow, a tragic plea, a ship forgotten beneath the restless sea. When shadows stir and silence speak, a tale begins, the fire seeks. In the vast, unforgiving waters of the North Atlantic, one ship's name is often overshadowed by the tragedy of the Titanic. But buried in the shadows of that fateful night, a hero's story lies forgotten until now. The Carpathia was 58 miles away when the Titanic struck its final blow, yet she answered the call no one else would. It wasn't just the ship that responded, it was every person on board, the captain, the crew, and even the passengers, willing to risk their lives without a second thought to save others. They braved the dark, freezing ocean, pulling 705 souls from the depth of despair, giving them a second chance at life. This is not just a rescue, it's the story of courage, compassion, and a crew who dared to do what no one else could, no matter the cost. Their names may not echo through history as loud as those of the Titanic's victims, but their legacy lives on in the lives they saved. Join me as we uncover the emotional truth behind the Carpathia, a ship and crew who answered the call when no one else would, reminding us that in the darkest moments, humanity has the power to rise above. The 3.5-hour journey of the Carpathia to the Titanic was very interesting and actually quite heartbreaking as well. Today we will talk about this forgotten or ignored part of these events, and although this ship trip may seem boring, after a deeper insight we will realize that it is much more than an average journey. We will now begin the story of the Carpathia a little before the Titanic's distress call. This ship was not a fancy ship like the Titanic or the ocean liners built for the rich, modeled after the Palace of Versailles. No, this ship was only once mobbed by journalists and photographers when it arrived back in New York. C.C. Swan and Hunter built this ship in Wallsend. She was launched in August 1902 with a small problem, but they prevailed. The ship, which could only travel at 14 knots, was designed to carry Hungarian immigrants from the Mediterranean ports to New York, where they could start a new life. This role also got some help by the ships called Slavonia and Pannonia in 1904, when Conrad guaranteed the Hungarian state permission to carry immigrants, but her first voyage was from Liverpool to Boston in 1904. In November, the Carpathia began her Mediterranean service, sailing back and forth throughout the year with the immigrants or American tourists, paying just £5.10 per trip. In April 1912, the Carpathia left New York port almost unnoticed. Her journey, which she had made countless times, was interrupted this time by a very famous ship that was leaving port on the other side of the ocean at the same time, none other than the Titanic, which had set off from Queenstown on its maiden voyage to New York. The captain of the Carpathia was 42-year-old Arthur Rostron, who had been in command of the Carpathia for 3 months now. She was carrying 700 passengers, 150 of whom were elderly American tourists, and the rest were immigrants who were about to visit home. On April 15, at 12:15 a.m., 15 minutes after midnight, the Carpathia's radio operator, Harold Cottam, was tying his shoelaces as he prepared to go to bed. He was still at his post 10 minutes after his shift ended, working with the headset on his head. It is incredible, but if we think about it, Harold only had to have finished his shift 10 minutes earlier to not being able to hear the distress call, and the story of the Titanic's survivors would have ended completely different. How? We never know, thankfully. But back to what happened. The first distress call from the Titanic came at 15 minutes past midnight, and Cotton immediately rushed to Captain Rostrom, who had already retired to his cabin for the night. After a moment of surprise, the captain asked Cotton if he was sure of what he had heard. The Titanic, the unsinkable, was sinking and needed help. After making sure that the news was true, Rostron immediately ordered a change of course. The Carpathia, which was 58 miles from the Titanic, set off at a speed of 14 knots to provide its assistance. But they knew that that speed, the journey would take more than 4 hours, so they had to think of something. The chief engineer gave the order to turn off the heating and hot water all over the ship, so that all the available steam could be used to drive the engines. Everyone whose work hours were over was immediately awakened and sent to shovel coal into the boiler as quickly as possible. Rostron ordered the first mate to prepare the ship to receive the survivors. The lifeboats were arranged so that they could be lowered as quickly as possible in case of need. Lights were lit on the side of the ship so the survivors would be able to see that someone is finally coming, and swing-like devices were made to pull children and infants up. The ladders were lowered, and the forward hold of the ship was prepared to accommodate both baggage and lifeboats. Meanwhile, the remaining crew were called back to work and prepared to do everything they could to accommodate 2,000 people in their existing rooms. These crew members collected blankets and warm clothes which they were going to distribute among the survivors. Hot tea, coffee and soup were made which would warm the passengers up after they were pulled out of the cold water. First aid rooms were set up in the 3 dining rooms, each with a doctor, in case of need. When everything was ready, the captain ordered the crew to drink coffee, for it is going to be a very long night. The ship was rattling as the engines were overworked and the boilers were loaded with coal. This little ship, designed for a maximum speed of 14 knots, reached 15, 16, and finally 17 knots, as in the darkness, without thinking or hesitation, she rushed into the iceberg-covered waters that claimed the ocean liner, which was called the Unsinkable. Without a radar or anything, only the lack of reflections in the water gave away the positions of the icebergs, hiding one by one. According to the legend, the chief engineer sometimes put his cap on the gauge so that no one could see how high the pressure was. This is such a small and seemingly insignificant action, but it speaks volume about the gravity of the situation, the stress of the moment, and the desperation they were feeling. The fact that he did that to prevent the crew from seeing how dangerously high the pressure was, it's a subtle act of trying to shield the crew from the chaos that was unfolding, but at the same time it also gives this eerie sense of foreboding too. It really shows how far people went to protect others, even when it meant risking or even sacrificing their own well-being. This small act was a perfect example of human resilience under a tremendous amount of pressure. No pun intended, I swear. It is important to know that the Carpathia was not the closest ship to the Titanic to help. The Californian was only 11 to 19 miles away. We don't really know the exact position. This ship could have saved many more people. The fact that they not intervene puzzled people for decades. Some theories say that a miscommunication caused them to not rush to help. Others say that actually there was a problem with the Californian's boiler, which meant they would not be able to restart them for a while. Others say the ship was surrounded by ice and they were kind of stuck. And still others say that the rockets that the Titanic fired made people think they were celebrating because they fired the wrong colored rockets. There are many theories out there, and each one says something different. One dark theory is that the captain of the Californian did not actually want to risk his ship and his crew sinking, so he simply did not go to their aid by ignoring the distress call. There are many theories, but unfortunately it is impossible to know 100% which one of it is true, and because we don't know the truth, it is unwise to jump into conclusions. What we do know, however, is that at 4 a.m. the Carpathia reached the last known position of the Titanic and the engines were shut down. The crew stood on the deck of the ship, along with the passengers who noticed the running around and the cold rooms. Everyone on board scanned the horizon, crew and passengers all together, hoping to see any survivors in the water. In the darkness, a green light appeared, the source of which was a crew member in Titanic's lifeboat number 2. The first survivor boarded the Carpathia at 4:10, and by 8:30 a.m., Charles Lightoller, the last survivor, was on board as well. The Californian arrived an hour after the Carpathia had avoided 20 icebergs and rescued 705 passengers. The Carpathia set off back to New York with twice the number of passengers, slowly making its way through the wreckage of the Titanic, hoping to find any survivors, but the ocean claimed the remaining passengers. The passengers and the crew of the Carpathia did everything they could. They offered the survivors their beds and even their clothes, but for many of the mourners, nothing could comfort them. So they offered them, if nothing else, a shoulder to cry on, or a strong hand to hold them when their legs gave under the weight of grief. The Carpathia arrived back in New York on April 18th, where a crowd of journalists awaited them. Reporters waited on small boats with megaphones for the Carpathia, whose crew they bombarded with questions. Rostron actually said very little about the Titanic disaster after the interviews, even in his book about his life, which he wrote after he retired. But many journalists asked him how this small ship, with a maximum speed of 14 knots, could exceed that speed, not to mention the fact that it glided past about 20 icebergs that night unsketched. All this on a night when it really mattered because lives were at stake. Rostron only said this, and I quote, "That night there was another hand on the wheel, not mine." End of quote. For his heroism, Captain Rostron was knighted by King George V. He was also awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, the Thanks of Congress, the American Cross of Honor, a medal from the Liverpool Shipwreck and the Humane Society, and a gold medal from the Shipwreck Society of New York. Rostron was highly praised for his efforts in both the American and the British inquiries into the disaster. He was also appointed a Knight Commander of the Order of the British Empire. He was then presented with a silver trophy on 29th of May 1912 on behalf of the survivors by Margaret Molly Brown, who had also been rescued by the Carpathia. This name may sound familiar, as she was the one who was later dubbed the Unsinkable Molly Brown for helping to evacuate the Titanic, then taking up the oar and urging the crew in Lifeboat 6 to go back and search for survivors, but to no avail. The now famous Carpathia then returned to the Mediterranean duty of hers until 1915, when she started to transport war supplies from New York to Liverpool. During its service, the Carpathia was hit by 3 torpedoes on the 17th of July 1918 and sank just 120 miles off Ireland. She sank 2.5 hours later after an explosion killed 5 of her crew. The 275 survivors were successfully rescued and taken to Liverpool. Although the Carpathia's days were cut short by torpedoes, the little ship from Tyne will always be remembered for its crew's heroic efforts, which they fully deserved for their selflessness and heroism. If you enjoy this tale, there's more to unfold, flickering stories in the fire's warm hold. But if this is all the time you have tonight, thank you for joining, for sharing the light. I whisper my thanks as the embers burn bright, and wait for you here in the soft firelight. My name is Creeps. Thank you for listening.